Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our September webinar in the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub's Expanded Horizons series, which is brought to you by Charles Sturt University and supported by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. My name is Prue Cook from Nine Creeks Consulting, and I'm your webinar host across the series. Now, you will need to bear with me today. I'm recovering from a cold, and our guest, Karen, despite doing some tech checks yesterday and poor Karen having to spend most of the afternoon on IT trying to get her camera to work and resolving that issue yesterday, we haven't been able to do that again today. The same issue has occurred. So we've quickly tried to call IT. We haven't been able to resolve it. So we're going to leave Karen's lovely picture up on the screen today, but unfortunately, Karen's camera is not playing ball with us today. So we apologize for that. You'll still be able to hear her. So this webinar series is for those of us who work with farming and regional communities, from policy to the paddock, and it challenges us to think differently regarding how we approach engagement, extension and adoption in Southern New South Wales, particularly concerning drought resilience, ag tech and biosecurity. And through this series, we've been exploring novel thinking and new ideas from different sectors, industries and countries to stimulate new approaches to collaboration and building rural resilience. Now, normally this is the part where I do an acknowledgement of country, but given our guest and our topic today, I'm going to hand over to Karen, who is the Southern New South Wales Hub's First Nation Engagement Officer.
Thank you, Prue, and good afternoon, everyone.
I'm
so sorry my camera is not working, but yes, we did have some challenges. Thank you, Prue. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal nations in which we meet, whose lands ground us in our work, nurture us to play, grow and care for others. We acknowledge the history of this land and for the stories of resilience and survival that make up Indigenous Australia. And we give thanks for Aboriginal elders and knowledge keepers of each generation, including the many Aboriginal communities that contribute to the life of our regions. Thank you, Prue.
Thank you, Karen. Very much appreciated. So it's really wonderful to have you here to talk through how to engage and design RD&E that considers and includes First Nations perspectives, experiences and expertise. It's certainly an area that I'm keen to improve my understanding and practice in the work that I do with agricultural and rural communities. So I'm very ready to learn a lot from you today. Now, just a quick note to our audience. If you've participated in one of these webinars before, it's not PowerPoint driven. This is so you can listen along even if you're in the car or if you have other work to do in the background, which we sometimes do. Karen and I are just going to have a conversation about her work and her experiences, and we invite you to ask questions or share your own experiences at any time through the chat function. You're also going to be sent a recording of the webinar after it finishes, so please don't worry if you need to leave early. Now, as always, we like to start these off by getting to know a little bit about our guests. So Karen, tell us about you, your country and your community.
And the nation in which I come from is about the size of a dot on the north coast of New South Wales, inland from Kempsey, but we are inland and coastal people. We're known as water people. My family is of the Dingo clan, and my nation is of the Sharks, so even my totems represent that inland and coastal kin group. I've been living and working in Wiradjuri country, which is the largest inland nation in southeastern Australia, for decades now, and I've very much become part of the Aboriginal community here. For the last 30 years, if you like, I have been working with Aboriginal people, families and communities. And that's taken me on a journey to places like, community education, to providing services within prisons, to writing programs and lecturing with Charles Sturt University. A lot of that time, for the last 20 years, for a lot of that time, I was a parish priest as well in rural communities. So I've also had a lot of contact with agricultural communities and people and families on the land and the Aboriginal communities out there. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to be able to mix with a very diverse and broad group of people.
Thank you, Karen. And just a quick note, we've had a couple of people jumping in a little bit later, just letting you know that we haven't been able to get Karen's camera to work today. So that's why you can't see her wonderful face except for the picture that we've got up on the screen. So just a quick note to those who are joining in late. So Karen, let's talk about your role now with the Southern New South Wales Innovation Hub. So obviously this series is hosted by the Hub, but it's the first time we've actually had a staff member present. So tell us a little bit about your work within the Hub.
I was, my title was Aboriginal Knowledge Broker. And within Aboriginal society, within our communities, we already have knowledge keepers, and myself and my colleague felt that that title wasn't appropriate for us because knowledge keepers within our communities are very well respected. So we requested the role of Aboriginal engagement officers, which really is much more fitting to what we do. So it's about building relationships with Aboriginal communities and engaging with them and learning of the issues and being able to empower them and to build on the strengths that already exist. So it's a lot of connecting, a lot of yarning, getting to know the elders and the community leaders, connecting with the Aboriginal organisations, many of whom I already knew, which made that a little easier. And just getting to know the people, getting to know their priorities, what is important to them, and to be able to build that into what we do.
And what are you finding in relation to drought as well too? What are some of are there consistent themes that are coming through that you're learning and hearing that are similar and or different from what the rest of the community are experiencing?
Is quite an issue, and research has shown that between 25 and 30% of Aboriginal communities in isolated areas experience food insecurity, and that's often because of poverty and the high price of local produce, and sometimes it's simply because of pure isolation or drought. You know, drought has actually caused issues with growing a lot of their bush foods and medicines that they have depended on, their weaving materials, all of that. So drought really impacts our people just on their, Aboriginal heritage and caring for country, and especially well-being, mental health. Yeah. So food insecurity is a particular issue, as well as access to water, and I'm talking about cultural rights to water. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so we can dig into that more in a little bit, but what we always like to start these webinars off with is a bit of a 101, and that's recognizing that we'll have some new practitioners in our mix or people who don't have a lot of experience with the subject matter. And in talking to you to prepare for this, Karen, you've sort of said that a lot of people that you do deal with have had, very limited engagements with Indigenous communities. So I think it's really important today that we spend a little bit of time going over some of the language and the importance in that background. So let's start off with some of the language. Let's talk about terminology. First Nations, Indigenous.
As I mentioned, I think what is really important is that you get to know the local community to the extent that you know the terminology that they prefer. For example, Indigenous Australians, that is a term that's often widely used, but here in southeastern Australia, you come across nations that don't like to use that. So it's about getting to know the community and the protocols of that community. First Nations is widely used. When we use the word Aboriginal, we should always say Aboriginal person or Aboriginal people as opposed to just Aboriginals. So we need to be sensitive to the location that we are at. I'm in South and Eastern Australia. I'm a Biripi woman, so I'm known as a Koori. If I was in Queensland, I'd be known as a Murray. And all of the states and all of the regions across Australia are different. So it's about getting to know the local community and what they prefer. And if, sometimes those sorts of things make us hesitate. And sometimes people are a little bit fearful about offending. But if you are genuine in your conversations, people will see that and they won't mind at all in you simply asking.
Yeah, perfect. And we did have a good conversation about that in preparing for this, Karen. Is that you said that often
That's right.
a bit of a barrier is people are afraid that they'll say the wrong thing.
Absolutely.
But
And
is that a real barrier
whatever
or a perceived
organisation I
barrier?
have worked for, and whatever group of non-Aboriginal people that I have been with, it has always been that issue of fear of difference or a hesitancy of difference, which is, in some respects, it's entirely normal because we are geared to look for people who look similar to us, but and that fear of difference. So it has been a barrier of people establishing networks and connecting with our communities and our organisations.
Okay, let's keep going through some terminology then. Let's have a bit of what are the roles within communities
Well, I
and
mentioned
community
knowledge
structure that we
keepers.
should be mindful
Knowledge
of?
keepers are people who have knowledge and who have the responsibility of holding knowledge in relation to, for instance, country. People who do cultural burning, the fire keepers, they're knowledge keepers of the impact of fire and the use of fire. So knowledge keepers are really important people in our community because they help with the transmission of culture. For instance, I have a dear friend here in Wagga who is the knowledge keeper of the Murrumbidgee River. So knowledge keepers are important people, and that role as knowledge keeper usually remains within families. So it's an inherited thing. Yeah. So that's knowledge keepers. We have custodians, and everyone is seen to be a custodian. And we all have that responsibility in caring for country. For instance, women have certain places that they need to care for, and that's known as women's places, and the same with men. They are custodians of the men's places. So that word custodian, that's what it means, and custodial rights in caring for country too. And what that, the role of a custodian is to make sure that the area in which they are responsible for remains healthy. That it's not degraded, that the life upon it is also cared for. So the responsibility of that is really important. When it comes to elders, people get confused because they tend to think that if an Aboriginal person is an older person, then they're an elder, and that's not entirely true. An elder is someone who has had responsibility and leadership within that community. And elders and knowledge keepers hold a lot of power in our community, and they're an important role. So, for instance, our elders here in Wiradjuri country and Biripi, where I come from, they are involved in local councils, the decisions that local councils make. Here in Wagga, actually across Wiradjuri country, our elders are involved in university education. They were behind the establishment of the Wiradjuri Language and Heritage Program. They are involved in policing. They are involved in the schools, and many communities across Australia, our elders are involved that way. And for instance, whenever I have started a new role, even if I have lived and worked in Wiradjuri country for many years, whenever I have started a new role, at the beginning of that role, I've always consulted the elders and the leaders of the community. That's protocol. That's what we do.
Excellent. All right, let's keep ticking off a bit more terminology. Sorry, business.
Hello? Yes.
Are you there, Karen? Sorry, we just lost you for a second there. Let's kick off a little bit more
Sorry
terminology.
business,
Sorry, business
is related to when someone dies within a community. And sorry business, depending on where you are within Australia, can go for several weeks to 6 weeks, for instance, in remote parts of Australia. And if you're in the Torres Strait Islands, sorry business goes for 12 months for the whole 6 seasons of the Torres Strait. So sorry business is a time of mutual family support, of supporting the bereaved. And it's like, you know, your mob, your community have the responsibility of doing that. Yeah. So sorry business is really respected, and it's a cultural responsibility for our people to be there when people need you, when someone has passed away, to support the family. Sorry business takes place a little differently in the Torres Strait Islands, because to mark sorry business, they have what's called a covering of the headstones. So when someone passes away in the Torres Strait, they put a cover on that person's headstone until the whole 6 seasons have passed. And just to sort of mark that, you know, there is that transition from life to death to life again, because we believe in reincarnation. So sorry business is marked very clearly in the Torres Strait, and at the end of the 6 seasons it's seen to officially have been over, and the spirit of that person has moved on, and the headstone then is uncovered. And sorry, can I keep?
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
for instance, I've been to
keep
communities,
going.
and you know, I have planned well in advance my visit there, and I remember clearly having to do some research in a community, and it's about 10 hours drive, you know, from Wagga, where I live, and I'd been out there, and I'd formed wonderful networks with the community, and you know, they were all really motivated, and then before I went out there, a few days before I went out, I rang them again just to sort of remind them of my visit, to make sure everything was okay. Then I got in the car and I drove out there, and no one was there because an elder had died. And the protocol when that happens is you simply have to wait, because you know, that is what is expected, and that's seen as being, as you know, and I had to wait until the leaders of that community were ready to participate. Yeah, and it was really interesting too, because when I was out there, you know, the school wasn't going. It's an Aboriginal community, so the school wasn't open that day, and you know, you could really see that the community was in a bit of turmoil, remembering that our mobs are very close, and our communities are very close, so that when someone dies, everyone feels it, you know, because in most of those places, everyone's related. So sorry business is really special, and it's a cultural responsibility that you're there and you support one another.
Excellent. Some other terminology that I have on my list, and if anybody's got other terminology that they want to explain, now is a really great opportunity. Karen's happy to answer any and all questions, but the other one that I've got on my list here too is law.
Yeah, that's
Karen,
a beautiful word.
LORE,
and
not LAW.
It means about the values that you have, the values that you live by in life. So for our people, it's about sharing what you have, because you see, we are not an individual Western culture, we are a collective culture, which means the common good and the needs of the welfare of the community is seen as being really a priority. So law is about the common good, and about the rules for caring for each other and for caring for country, remembering that we are country ourselves. So law is really important. And here in Wiradjuri country, they talk about Yindamari Yumbawan. And what that means is that you go slowly, you don't rush. And it's about respecting and caring for each other and respecting country and all of life upon it. Yeah. So Yindamari number one is a really important law for Wiradjuri people. And it's those values are quite common across Australia.
Excellent. Now, Karen, we've got a question going back to your conversation about sorry business, the use of images during sorry business period, the use of images of deceased people.
Well,
what do we need to do to be respectful and appropriate around that?
Of people who have passed away, we need to be careful in the way that we use them. And Aboriginal people would not use the images of someone who has passed away for quite a while after their death. And if you're going to, then you need to have a warning before you actually show it, and if it's someone within a community that you work within, then I would always suggest that you actually speak to a community leader or elder to find out whether it's okay to use that now.
Excellent, thank you. You're talking about this importance of taking things slow and giving things time and giving respect to that time. Often from a Western perspective, we're not given that time, Karen. We're constantly rushing, hurrying. What advice would you give for us in terms of how we can slow down and be respectful of that process when we're trying to manage deadlines and just get all of these things done that we're used to just sort of rushing through?
Know that if we're thinking of multiple things at once, then very often that's when we make mistakes and we don't do near as well at times than if we're actually doing things more mindfully. And there is a term called Dadira, and Dadira was first introduced by Rose Ungamir up in the Daly River, and it's about mindfulness and it's about just going slowly, and the importance of that, not just for others, but for yourself, to care for yourself.
Excellent. Now, I think it's really important that this topic requires us to consider our own level of cultural awareness and cultural bias. So what are some examples of cultural bias that you come up against, and what impact are these biases having?
Discrimination. And I'm going to use, let's name cultural bias, eh? We all have, as I mentioned before, we are geared to be really inclusive of people who look and sound and act like us, because naturally we feel most at home with those kinds of people. And we naturally, the brain sends out a little bit of warning signal when we are with others who are different to us. And we tend to be, and research has shown this over and over again, we tend, and very unconsciously, unconscious bias is quite dangerous, especially when you're working in community, because we unconsciously don't favour people. We tend to look at them more negatively than we do positively. And it's really important to be mindful of that, of what's happening. And we call this professional self-reflection. What is it that, what are the messages? What are the things that you learned about Aboriginal people as you were growing up, at school, from your parents, from your community? What are the stereotypes, that have been around about Aboriginal people where you are? And just be mindful that, the most accurate information we can have about another person is through that primary information, which is, for instance, having contact with people and having a relationship with people. We too easily depend on the media and others to form an opinion, which is really dangerous. Yeah. So when we think about, and it's really common right across our society, right in every institution, we think about the Adam Goods stuff, several years ago. He's Australian of the Year. He was proud to be an Aboriginal man. But because he was proud, he was denigrated on the footy field, and he was booed continuously. We think about Stan Grant Jr.'s experience on Q&A a few months ago, and he's had to leave that particular role with the ABC because of the hate mail that he received. So discrimination and racism within our society is within every institution. And we need to really be aware of that. For instance, in the legal profession, an Aboriginal young person is much more likely to go up before a judge than that young person is to get a warning by a policeman. And that's why we have so many people in prison, so many young people in prison. Very often they might be stealing, and very often it's because of food. So we need to be mindful of what we have been told and how we have been socialised about Aboriginal people, all of the stereotypes, and just start to reflect on that and start to build those connections and those relationships. And only then can we form really honest and, we can work with integrity, if you know what I mean, because our people, we have grown up with racism and discrimination in our lives, and our people are really good at detecting unconscious bias in a worker. Yeah. So that self-reflection is really important, because another typical example is, people go into our communities and they come away thinking, I know what that community needs. And, that kind of paternalism has historically been there throughout decades of working with our mob. So instead of thinking, I know what that community needs, we need to think about, I'm going to explore, I'm going to build a relationship with this community and find out from them. Yeah.
And this is a really good segue into our next part of the conversation, Karen, because obviously, you're talking about things being done to people instead of done with them. And that's certainly something that we've discussed on numerous touch points through this series in relation to farming communities, regional communities. So it's certainly some similar themes that we've explored, but looking at it through a different lens. Another theme that we've explored fairly regularly through this webinar series has been through how impactful telling stories can be in getting engagement and getting people to change. So we've had a farmer speaking about, using stories to gain traction on climate change. We've had an academic talking about, creative nonfiction storytelling as a way of driving practice change. Let's talk about the importance of stories from a First Nations perspective. What's the significance of story, and what are stories designed to do? And you mentioned in your introduction the importance of yarning. So can you tell us a little bit about what this looks like and how it's impacting your work
with each other? Aboriginal people share their story, and they share their story before they even get down to business. So sharing your story is really important. And I'll give you an example. A good friend of mine now, when I first met her, she was working in an organisation, and she had come from Victoria. And, when I first went to have a meeting with her, it was a work meeting. We spoke for an hour and a half sharing our story. And most of that was a good 50% of that was our personal story. And by the end of that hour and a half, we actually never really got down to business. But we were yarning. And what happens when you're yarning is that you share your story. And then as you share, the story gets deeper and deeper. I don't know if people would understand that, but yeah, so story is used for yarning, and it's a way of connecting. So, when you're meeting someone, it's really important to say, hey, let's have a yarn. because they will know what you mean when you say that. It's the way we communicate. It's not the way Westerners communicate. Westerners communicate with time limits. And when we yarn, our limit is when the stories are told. And so your yarning and storytelling is used to connect with each other. The other things it's used for is to transmit values. We transmit cultural knowledge to younger generations through story, and we transmit lore, L-O-R-E, Aboriginal lore through our stories. What is expected of them as they grow and as an adult? What are the values that we expect, of our young people, and that's really important. And there's a lot of places in Australia that are still doing men's and women's initiations, and that's a really important time of lore and of storytelling, because those young people going through initiations are told more sophisticated stories. So stories of one's responsibilities for country and for each other, become deeper and more sophisticated as that person matures. So story is used for transmitting values. The other reason that story is told, and I've already mentioned culture, but the other reason story is told is through survival. We have so many ancient stories of survival on this continent, and they are really of critical importance on how to survive, and the many the many climate changes and changes in landscape and what have you that our people have lived through, and they are really ancient stories. I'll give you an example. One of my favourite places is Lake Mungo, and it's a national park, and it's jointly managed with the Barkindji people and National Parks and Wildlife. And in the 50s and 60s, scientists came there, and the Barkindji people shared a story with them about a giant beast that used to live there. And Lake Mungo is now just sand hills. You'd think that you were standing on the moon, because it's desert and it's just sand hills, and a bit of salt bush, And they shared, and they described this animal so much detail to the scientists and the archaeologists, and they just completely ignored them until they actually found the remains of this animal. And it looks like a giant wombat the size of a room, but it's the diprotodon. And the diprotodon existed 30,000 years ago. Now, that story had been passed down for all of that time through the Barkindji people. But it's not just Barkindji people, Wiradjuri people. Nations right across Australia have similar stories on how to survive, and the creatures, the animals, the life that has lived on their country. Also stories about the stars, the astronomy Aboriginal astronomy is very different to Western astronomy.
Karen, we've had one of our participants has popped in a comment that says, for me, storytelling also provides an opportunity
Yes.
to test to see if you are merely
That's
listening.
Right. And, and that word listening is really important, because you've got to take the time to listen to the story and listen to where people are at. And it's only if you respectfully provide, because working with our mob always takes much longer than working for many other communities. So it's about taking the time to listen to the story. And when people see you doing that, they actually start to begin to understand that you are authentic and you have integrity in the way that you respect Aboriginal ways of being and doing. Yeah.
And so, Karen, can I ask then that if we don't allow that time for that listening and that deep understanding, where we're listening to understand, not listening to respond, if we don't do that right,
Not
what
only, yeah,
happens?
not only
We don't
do
build those
you not build
relationships,
the
things don't progress.
relationships, but they don't reveal to you, they won't trust you. So it's, and like, trust is often takes longer in Aboriginal communities because we live in a colonising society. Colonisation is not something that happened in, and is done and dusted. It's continuing. We still live in a discriminatory society. So we're still trying to get in the constitution. So, it takes time to build that trust. Yeah.
Okay, we've had another question come in as well too. What are the differences we need to be
Well, there's
aware of when
men's
speaking with
business and
members of
their
the
women's
opposite sex?
business. And what that means is women will not reveal anything about, talking about their women's health, about birthing, about, relationships, about women's places on country, about business. I'll give you an example. I was working in one community, and there was National Parks and Wildlife have the responsibility of keeping a record of Aboriginal sites. And it was an area that was rich with Aboriginal sites, and there were men's places and there were women's places, and initiation sites and all sorts of scarred trees. And it was that there were men Aboriginal sites officers within National Parks and Wildlife. And eventually they actually employed a woman. And it wasn't until a woman was employed that they were able to map all of the female sites in the parks. So, yeah, there is a real difference between, not difference, but yeah, men's and women's places and men's and women's business.
Excellent. But in terms of communicating, if I was to approach a male, provided I'm not asking any health questions or to see, any of their areas that are, men's only areas, there's nothing in terms of general
You'd have to get
communication that we need to be
approval.
mindful of.
You'd have to get permission from an Aboriginal elder or the custodian for that area.
I mean, just in terms of general conversation. Sorry, Karen. If you're just talking to a member of the opposite sex, is there anything that we need to be mindful of outside of not asking about health concerns or about seeing specific places, just in general conversation or
not when
approaching
it
a
comes to
particular
men's and women's
organisation?
business. I think I've already mentioned that it's health and relationships and knowledge of country. They're the main things that come up when you're talking about men's and women's business.
Beautiful. Now, Karen, a lot of the participants who regularly participate in this webinar work in agriculture, work in agricultural extension, do a lot of work with farmers, myself included. And so, a requirement to work with First Nations people as part of our work isn't something that we've had a lot of exposure to, but it is increasingly becoming something that we're needing to do more and more. So for complete people who are very new to this, what do we need to consider when engaging with First Nations people or organisations? What are our first steps?
Interfere. And I think what is really important is to be yourself and to be authentic and to be genuine, and people will see through that. And a really good way of developing relationships or starting out to do that is, for instance, through things like NAIDOC Week or Reconciliation Week or events that the Aboriginal community might have to participate. And they will soon get to know you. And that not only will they soon get to know you, but they'll start to realise that you're actually interested in the community. Yeah. So that's really important. And I remember speaking to one of our knowledge brokers in this region, and it was in Reconciliation Week, and she decided what she was going to do is they were having a walk during Reconciliation Week, the Aboriginal community where she lives. So she joined them, you know. So there's lots of events that happen, and they are a really good foot in the door for getting to know the community. Um, and most communities have events like that. But also, doing a bit of a mapping exercise, working out the Aboriginal organisations where you are, finding out who the elders are and other community leaders. For instance, I'll just give you an example of Wagga. For instance, in Wiradjuri country, we have an Aboriginal consultative group, we have an elders group, we have a women's and a men's group, we have an Aboriginal medical service, an Aboriginal legal service. We have Aboriginal people that work in all of the schools. Yeah, so, and so you have these people within communities, and it's a really good thing to do a bit of a mapping exercise, simply in getting to know people. And sometimes when you link up with just one or two people, they can be a bit like a cultural mentor in a community as well. So that you can sort of consult on protocols and who can tell you who the elders are and can help you put together that kind of a map. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, what are some of the cross-cultural issues that
In
we need to be mindful of?
communication, remembering that the elders, for instance, have a lot of respect, and they have important leadership in our communities, and which is different to Western societies. Our elders are really important people, so they hold a lot of sway, and it's always important to include them in your consultations. Um, in communication, our people simply want to please at times, and too often they will say yes and agree to um, what agree to something when in fact they mean no. And I know that that sounds confusing, but a lot of cultures actually do it when they simply want to please the speaker, because you see, assertiveness skills to say no and to give a reason, assertiveness skills are Western skills. They're not Aboriginal styles of communicating. So sometimes our people will say yes when they mean no, and it's really important to sort of use open questions around that, just to check. That's really important. Eye contact is another thing. Our people tend not to use eye contact so much, and I always encourage people that if you are with an Aboriginal person, to simply observe and use the same kind of communication skills. For instance, I had a dear friend who was Yorta Yorta. He was a Yorta Yorta man, and he was my colleague at a place that I used to work. And he would always, whenever we met up in an office, he would always sit side. He would come and sit, but he never sat front on. So that's a body language difference. And eye contact was not often used. So it's always important just to observe and to follow the example. Yeah. You'll soon learn simply through observation, but there are quite a few I guess, verbal and non-verbal differences in communication. Silence is another one that our people use because they want to please. Very often they won't say no. They might just, you might just get silence. And sometimes silence is used as a sign that they're actually giving weight to what you said. If you've asked them a question that affects others, they're not going to give you an answer until they actually check with their mob or check with their community, because we make decisions differently to non-Aboriginal people. remembering it's a collective culture. So very often we need to include the collective in the decisions that are made. For instance, when it comes to the voice, our people, Wiradjuri people, we decided, many Aboriginal people in Wiradjuri country decided that they would vote yes. And then they opened that up to, once they had decided, they had public meetings with the rest of the community to talk about why they were voting yes. And the elders led that, and they were very much involved in that. So the way that we make decisions can take a long time, and we need to be aware of that. Our body language is different. And yeah, I guess they're the main ones. Thank you, Prue. Yeah.
Good. And let's talk about consultation. And, I often hear that, particularly so in my part of the world, often hear, our Indigenous organisations are very over-consulted. They've got there's too much happening. What does good, effective consultation look like here with both communities and organisations? How do we be mindful of, not providing too much workload, but ensuring that
Yes,
consultation is actually meaningful and not tokenistic?
It's about taking your time and not rushing it, and being respectful until they have the time. That's really important. Again, we are pushed for time, and we like to get things done in certain time frames. But what is important is that you actually get to know that organisation, and then you wait for the right time for them. That's really important. And consultation, if you go in there with your own priorities and you're not prepared to listen, they'll soon discern that, and you won't get much traction with that organisation. What is really important is the listening and the yarning and getting to know them. Yeah. And eventually they will tell you what their priorities are, and learning about the strengths of that community and that organisation as well, because we have a lot of strengths that can be built on.
Excellent. Now, Karen, whenever I talk to anybody at the Hub, they're talking about this wonderful project that you've been working on with the community garden. So can you tell us a little bit about that project, how it came about, how you got to creating this project, and what you're going to do?
I just want to backtrack a little bit on that question about consultation, because consultation, it's also about going there with the right mindset and none of that cultural bias. As I said, they'll soon work that out, and you won't get very far if you're not reflecting on the way in which you come across. And also, self-determination is important for our people, and empowering them. Having empowering relationships and collaborating on projects, and helping them to have the power and leading the project. And I guess that's what I've done with Tumut. I got to know the Tumut community quite slowly, and I spent time just being there and working out the leadership of that community. And there were a few people there, actually only one or two people there, that I used as mentors, again, cultural mentors. And I used them to learn of the priorities of that community and to help me connect with the organisation that I needed to connect with, which was the local Aboriginal Lands Council. And occasionally I would drop in there, and there was a lot of yarning that happened in building that relationship. And one day I was there, and there was a women's group that was meeting there, and they were talking about the impact of drought and severe temperatures on their community, and how that affected their families, and how domestic violence really increased, and the issues around mental health in their communities. And actually, that on three sides of their community, the fires, there were terrible fires just a few years ago. So there was a lot of trauma in that community, and they were broken off, the roads. They were really isolated because of those fires, and there was a lot of trauma. So through discussions, they spoke about the work that they'd been doing with local land services, how they'd learnt to propagate trees and propagate, and how they'd been planting trees, and how they were really interested in working on country. And wouldn't it be great if they could have a community garden so that, the women could meet and support each other, especially during times like that. And they already had a lot of partnerships with the local school. They were very much involved with the local school, again with the local land services. They worked alongside the men's group occasionally. The local family support service was involved with them on a regular basis. So they've and the local council had given back had given a parcel of land to the Aboriginal Lands Council. So it was like all of these beautiful partnerships were in place. It's sort of like weaving, To me, it's like, all of these lovely partnerships in that community. And as I got to know them, I was able to empower them to take the next step, to use a lot of the skills that they'd learnt to develop this project and to move forward with this community garden. So they're an extremely motivated group. They're a wonderful group. It's not just the women's group, but there are people from all over that community in the working group. We set up a working group. So they've done their cultural burning of this particular area. There's a certain wattle tree in there that's really great for making spears. So they can teach, some of the younger ones how to do that. There's some really good wood for making didgeridoos. They want to grow a lot of their bush medicines and bush foods, but also a lot of the more common foods that are found in supermarkets that are just so expensive because they are very isolated. So that's the project, and we obtained funding for a project officer for 2 days a week to steer that project, and that person is going to be in place for all of the 4 seasons. And that working group is developing the protocols for the use of that community garden for the rest of the community. A local retired horticulturalist is doing the garden design at the moment. And so there's a lot of in-kind stuff that's being provided by the community and the local lands council, but also the men's and the women's group as well. So it's very exciting, and it's so wonderful to see them so motivated, and it's quite an honour to work with them. So it's been a real partnership, but they have many partnerships, and I was just our hub is just one of them. So it's wonderful to be able to collaborate and empower that community to move forward with the skills that they already have. Yeah.
That's wonderful, Karen, and I really like that analogy around weaving, essentially. Spending the time to get to know and understand where all the players would sit there and then weaving them together.
Aboriginal community, that's how I see it. You just sort of weave those relationships, and it's really lovely. It's really good.
Karen, I could keep talking to you all day, but we are nearly at time. This is the opportunity. Again, please, Karen is an open book to ask any questions that you might not feel comfortable asking ordinarily. So please pop them in the chat right now if you've got any outstanding. While we wait for our last couple of questions to come in, Karen, we recognise in this webinar series that a 1 hour chat is certainly not enough to become an expert in anything. If people want to go away and learn, read, listen, do more, what are some of your recommendations in terms of books or podcasts or anything like that
the
can help
very
people further
first
their
place
understanding
people
here?
need to look is in their local community, because our heritage, Aboriginal heritage and cultural practices are so rich, and there are so many strengths within our communities that we just need to tap into. So learning from the people themselves is really important. And I couldn't stress that enough. Getting to know the groups and the organisations within your community. There are some really good podcasts, developing relationships, working in Aboriginal communities. They're all the kind of titles that will bring up some really good podcasts. Bruce Pascoe has got some wonderful stuff online about country. Stan Grant has got some fantastic stuff. So some really good podcasts on discrimination. And there's some really good textbooks that I could send to you, Prue, for distribution to participants. But I think it's really about getting to know the local community, reading as much as you can, listening to podcasts, watching NITV, and just tuning in to your local community. Yeah. Remembering that they are all different.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you so much, Karen. That's all we're going to have time for today. Thank you very much to our audience for joining in and for your questions. We hope that this has stimulated your thinking and given you the confidence to learn more from and engage with your local Indigenous organisations and communities. I'll now pop up the registration for our October webinar. So you should see that on your screen. And for this one, we're going straight back to the core of agricultural extension. How and why do farmers adopt new practices or technologies? And how can we design programs and products to best facilitate this adoption? Our guest is going to be Professor David Pannell. He's the Professor for the Centre of Environmental Economics and Policy in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Western Australia. So heading west for our guest. So farmer adoption is really essential here to realise the benefits of research and innovation. Yet all too often, our brochures and fact sheets, events, tools, practices fail to gain the traction that we want. So what are we getting wrong? Is it information overload in today's digital age? Is it our approaches to extension need modernising? Or perhaps it's a shift in mindset that's needed, and mindsets come up again here today. Hit the register button on your screen and you can find out next month. Once this webinar finishes, you'll be directed to a survey link. It would be very much appreciated if you could please fill it out. I know nobody likes doing these, but it should take less than a minute. And I really use the information provided in those surveys to look for guests and topics that we can do for future webinars. Thank you for bearing with us through failing technology and smoke alarms today.
Pleasure.
Very much appreciated. Thank you, Karen. Thank you again for participating in today's Expanded Horizon webinar delivered by the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.